The Ogre's battle strategy is one of the more simple ones. You simply want to attack the enemy and hit them a lot harder than they can hit you to wipe them out as quickly as possible. They're a bunch of very chunky boys that rely on their size to make up for their small unit sizes, meaning you need to manage your numbers carefully to ensure you don't get overrun by armies that can sometimes outnumber you 10 to 1. Let's first go over the pros and cons of the Ogre's battle gameplay. First of all, the pros. As I said, it rewards an aggressive playstyle with a lot of unit mass to throw around to push your way through enemy lines. If you want to press the attack and never low up the pressure, then these guys will be a great faction for you. They also have a ton of large units with high HP pools, so the enemy is going to need to work 5 times as hard to take out just one of your entities as you take out a handful of theirs. They also have one of the more powerful ranged rosters in the game, with not a lot of options, but most of them being great picks and extremely powerful. As for the cons, their aggressive playstyle does mean you need to be on top of your micro to keep your units moving forward. If you take too long to react, you can lose your advantage and put yourself seriously behind in battles. Their focus on large units does mean they are very vulnerable to ranged units, so if you're not able to shut them down, they can ruin your day extremely quickly. They also have a smaller unit size than most other factions, meaning you're going to be outnumbered in basically every fight you go into, so if you let the enemy surround you, it can be a very rapid decline from there. The Ogres have access to a couple of abilities in battle. They have the 3 army abilities that are displayed along the right hand side of the screen, and you unlock them in order from the bottom to the top as you kill enemies that are broken or shattered. Each ability costs a certain amount of points, so if you're getting enough, you can actually use them in pretty rapid succession, and of course each ability has internal cooldowns to prevent too much spam. The 3 abilities from bottom to top are Dismember, which reduces acceleration by 65% and speed and charge speed by 60% for 23 seconds in a 55 meter area of effect. This one is obviously great for slowing down charging enemies, such as Cav or other Ogres. Massacre grants 25% armor piercing weapon damage and 20% base weapon damage, as well as allowing targets within a 35 meter area to cause terror for 26 seconds. This is a great one for casting on your front line's damage dealers, since those percentage based buffs will only get more value the more base damage you have. And finally Butcher, which grants 1.6% HP regen per second and 25% vigor regen per second for 18 seconds. This one is of course best used on any units that are tired or taking a lot of damage to keep them healthy and moving forward. On top of this, there are also a couple of passives that affect nearly every unit in the roster. Ogre Charge is a passive that allows every Ogre infantry unit, as well as lords and heroes, and to be clear that means infantry units that are Ogres, so Gorges and Noblars don't have it. All it does is allow them to only lose half of their charge bonus when colliding with braced charge defenders, resulting in a more devastating charge that is very hard to stop. A lot of units also have the Wall Breaker passive, which, unsurprisingly, allows them to break walls by walking up and giving them a whack. This is on every unit aside from both the Noblars, the Saber Tusks, and the artillery units. This adds up to a faction that has no need for towers or battering rams, since they are faster and can dismantle a wall in moments. Now let's get into the roster, starting first with the Lords, and starting first with Greasus Goldtooth. He deals armor piercing anti-large damage, is a melee expert, and of course has Ogre Charge, and he is always riding his mobile throne. So of course looking at this lad you can tell he's not exactly the most mobile chap in the game. He's not the fastest and he doesn't have the fastest charge, but he does have a very chunky health bar alongside some respectable armor and pretty brilliant damage. He's the guy you want to send into the front lines and pretty much leave him there to dish out a ton of punishment. Of course, being such a large target, you want to keep him safe from being totally surrounded by a lot of high damage or focused by ranged units, but aside from that, he can really go to town. Add in his bonus versus large, and he can also take on other ogres or enemy monsters with relative ease. The cherry on top of the magical attacks, and even enemies with resistance are going to feel the weight of your attack. He also has a couple of abilities. Everyone has their price, which debuffs an enemy unit with leadership and melee attack, and Stand Your Ground, which defensively buffs nearby allied units. Our other legendary lord is Scrag the Slaughterer, and he's a spellcaster as well as dealing armor-piercing anti-infantry damage. He comes with the Lore of the Great Maw, and while Scrag isn't as large or in charge as Greasus, so isn't quite as tanky or hit quite as hard, his smaller size does come with some advantages. He's significantly faster, so can hit enemies with a more devastating charge, as well as being able to defend himself a little better due to him actually being stood up. He is still a formidable force in combat with great damage and excellent melee stats that make him into an infantry blender that can wipe units off the map in moments. Add on top of this his Lore of the Great Maw, and he is extremely deadly. The Lore has some great spells for high damage, as well as powerful buffs, so it is best to keep him central in battles to provide support wherever needed. All in all, he's a more versatile lord than Greasus, with very high damage potential if he can make full use of all of his aspects. Just be sure to keep him safe from being swamped or focused from a range, as like all ogres, he is still a pretty large target. I'll stop mentioning their size and its weakness now, but just know that any ogre unit here has the exact same problem. He also has the extra ingredients ability that increases the magical recharge rate. The first of our non-legendary lords is the Slaughter Master. These are spellcasters, iron fists, and deal armor piercing damage. They can come with either Lore of Beasts or the Lore of the Great Maw. Now these function very similar to Scrag, as they have powerful melee prowess on top of access to 2 very powerful laws of magic, allowing them to provide value in a variety of scenarios. They don't deal quite as much damage, but they are a little tougher and faster, so are still plenty powerful and want to be used pretty much the same way. Get them stuck in the front lines, dishing out a ton of damage whilst casting spells wherever support is needed. Not really much else to say, since they are just that similar and can perform the same job almost as well. They also have a couple of abilities: Belly Slapper, which reduces nearby enemy melee attack, and extra ingredients. Our final lords are the Tyrants. These are armoured and deal armor piercing damage, and are melee experts. These guys are what you would get if Greasers got up and lost a little bit of weight. They are extremely tanky frontlines fighters with a massive amount of health and armour alongside brilliant damage and melee stats and great speed. This all makes them into probably the most balanced fighter of the lords, as they can really just get in there and do whatever they need to do. Of course, they don't have the same versatility as Slaughtermasters, so I probably would go for them over these lads most of the time, but they are still formidable lords and perform exactly the same whether they're Winds of Magic or not. They also have a couple of abilities: Snacks, which grants passive HP regeneration, and Foe Seeker, which grants speed and vigour. Coming to the heroes now, first up we have the Hunters. These deal armour piercing anti-large damage and are pretty great melee combatants. These are great all-round battle heroes with massive damage, decent melee stats, and passable survivability. This makes them into absolute tanks in battle that can absorb enemy hits like they are nothing and just keep on coming. On top of this, they also deal excellent damage both in melee and from a range, and do anti-large bonus damage, allowing them to snipe enemy large targets with ease. Finally, they're also pretty speedy and have a tasty bit of charge bonus, so there really isn't much they can't do. They're excellent to take with you in battles, as they can spam a few ranged shots to soften up the enemy before moving in to finish them off with little risk to themselves. They also come with the Crippling Throw ability that deals massive damage to an enemy target, as well as crippling them. They can also pick up a Stonehorn mount, which grants them a huge amount of armor and HP and makes them into the tankiest character you can get as the Ogres. They also gain a ton of damage and charge bonus, as well as anti-infantry in melee combat, allowing them to become a great multi-class unit that can take on everything and come out on top. Next up we have the Butchers. These are spellcasters and deal armor piercing damage and are decent melee combatants. Like the Lords, they can come with the Law of Beasts or the Law of the Great Maw. Now these are more or less slightly weaker versions of the Slaughtermaster Lords. They come with less armor, HP, melee defense and damage, but otherwise are totally the same and can make full use of the exact same laws of magic. I would say use them the same as the Lords, so get them involved in the front lines, whilst providing spell support wherever needed. Just be a little bit more careful than you are with the Lords, since those minor defensive changes can make a big difference depending on what you're going up against. And finally, they also come with the extra ingredients ability. And our final heroes are the Fire Bellies. These are spellcasters and deal armor piercing flaming attacks, and they of course come with the Law of Fire. In typical Law of Fire fashion, these lads are all about all-out offense with little consideration for keeping themselves safe. They come with even less melee defense than Butchers, but gain a spot of leadership as well as melee attack, weapon strength and charge bonus. On top of this, they have magical and fire attacks, as well as the Law of Fire, and the less armoured enemy isn't going to know what hit them. You want to use these guys like the glass cannons they are, and dip them into combat with some support versus something they can take out pretty easily and quickly to minimise the harm to themselves. Alongside this, one, make full use of that Law of Magic to dish out as much damage as they possibly can before the enemy can react. Finally, they also have a few abilities. Fire Breath, which allows them to do a nice chunk of damage to enemies from a range, Flaming Carnot, which reflects damage back at the attacker in melee, and Eruption, which explodes around them for a bit of damage and space creation. Now we come to the melee infantry, and we have our one and only unit, the Noblars. These are a tier 1 unit, and are an expendable meat shield with poor leadership. If you've ever played the Greenskins, then these guys will look somewhat familiar. They are pretty much the Ogre version of Goblin Spears, with pitiful damage, defense, and leadership, adding up to a unit that is only really good for slowing down the enemy and giving their lives to keep more important units safe. This should be all you're using them from, as by themselves they have a hard time knocking over a blade of grass. Always have them going alongside some Ogres to keep them safe and give them time to dish out a ton of damage. Avoid sending them in alone unless you have literally no choice, as you'll be basically feeding the enemy kills without really doing anything to contribute to your own victory. Our only ranged infantry is the Noblar Trappers. These are a tier 2 unit, or a hybrid unit, come with Stalk, Vanguard deployment, Noblar traps, and are still expendable. These are literally the exact same as regular Noblars, but they now have Vanguard deployment and their ranged weapons. These allow them to get around the enemy and rain fire with some pretty poor weapon damage from a pretty short range. The one upside of these missiles is that they also slow whatever they hit, making it harder for them to run away and get off a charge, meaning your other units will have an easier time taking them out. Similar to regular Noblars, you don't want these guys to be your main damage dealer, so always keep them as a complement to something with more damage, and you should be just fine. Coming now to the Cavalry and Chariots. First up we have the Mournfang Cavalry. These are a tier 3 unit, and are armoured and deal armour piercing damage. Something this large has no right being as fast as it is, but here we are. These bad boys are exceptionally speedy for something of their girth, and they pack a pretty wacky wallop when they make contact, with their great charge bonus and pretty substantial weapon strength. They don't have the best melee stats in the world and are obviously pretty large hitboxes, so you want to pull them out after charging to keep them on the move and cycle charge as much as possible. Fortunately, they also come with a nice bit of armor, so won't take too many hits if you forget about them, so long as they aren't going against anything with a ton of armor piercing damage. Use them to dismantle the enemy back lines before coming back to flatten the backs of the enemy front lines in likely a single charge, and you can't go far wrong. They also come in a couple of variations. The Iron Fists are another tier 3 unit, and are armoured Iron Fist units and deal armor piercing damage. These lads simply come with more armor, a bronze shield, and a little more melee defense. This doesn't really change how you want to use them since their melee attack is not the greatest, but it's a nice little upgrade if you're prone to forgetting about them once you send them in. Our other variation is the Great Weapons. These are another tier 3 unit, and are armoured and deal armor piercing anti-large damage. Another small change here, with the only difference being the bonus versus large. This makes them a little better versus enemy large units, so choose your targets accordingly. You're still not going to leave them in combat, so the way you use them hardly changes, just what you use them against. Next up we have Iron Fist Crushers. These are a tier 3 unit, obviously an Iron Fist unit, and are armoured and deal armor piercing damage. Crushers bring the same great speed and passable melee defense of Mournfangs, and now improve every single other stat, making them tougher and hit a lot harder, and actually be decent melee fighters, as well as devastating charges. Of course, the optimal way to use these lads is still cycle charging to make the most of that huge bonus, but if you're not the best at micro, you can totally get away with sending these guys in and leaving them, as their great melee stats and huge damage will make short work of anything, whilst their armor and HP will ensure they don't take too many hits for their trouble. Use them the same as Mournfangs to wipe out enemy ranged before coming back to take out front lines in an instant. And Crushers also come in another variation, Crushers with Great Weapons. These are a tier 3 unit and are armoured and deal armor piercing anti-large damage. These guys have exactly the same improvements over Great Weapons Mournfangs as the Crusher Iron Fists did over the Mournfang Iron Fists. All the same stats go up by the exact same amount, making them better at all the same jobs, and the new choice for sending versus enemy large targets to dismantle them with their massive damage and bonus versus large. These guys don't have the same melee defense as Iron Fists, so won't be quite as hardy in melee combat, but they will still charge just fine and do a ton of damage to large targets if you can find one. Aside from that, you want to use them the same, but maybe focus on cycle charging a little bit more to avoid them taking too much damage. We now come to by far the largest section, the Beasts and Monsters. First up we have the Saber-Tusk Pack. These are a tier 1 unit and are very fast and can go on rampages. These are pretty much the Ogre equivalent of Warhounds, but a lot bigger and hit a lot harder to make up for their smaller model count. This makes them much better at taking out enemies on the initial clash, but makes them slightly worse at mopping up once they are on the run. Nevertheless, they are still a fantastic early game flanking unit, as they can easily get around the enemy front line and into their ranged troops to take them out without too much trouble. Once there is nothing left for them here, they can come and help out by flanking the front lines and attacking the rear, but just make sure the enemy is going to break in the first couple of minutes after they attack, otherwise their low melee defense and armor mean they will take a ton of hits and they will likely go on a rampage. Once they do, they are likely to use half a unit or more. As long as you keep them safe and under control, they should do great work for you early on before the enemy gets any armor online. Next we have the Ogre Bulls. These are a tier 2 unit, are a damage dealer, and a weak versus armor. These boys are the basic Ogre infantry, and they make up the meat of your early game damage. They are a great all-round unit with plenty of health to make them tanky enough despite their low armor, and decent damage despite their below average melee stats. This makes them into the perfect unit to embed in some Noblars to make your front lines a powerhouse of damage output. They are of course also pretty dang speedy, and have a nice bit of charge bonus, so charge them in and out of combat. It's also a very valid way to use them to maximize their damage output. But if you aren't about that micro life, sustained combat will work just as well versus most early game units. These guys also come in a couple of variations. Dual Weapons are a tier 2 unit and are an anti-infantry damage dealer and still weak versus armor. They simply pick up bonus damage versus infantry, so you want to get them onto the front lines versus the enemy infantry and leave them there to get the most value out of them, changing nothing else about how you use them over regular bulls, and you can't really go far wrong. They really are just that simple. The other variation is Iron Fists. These are a tier 2 unit, obviously Iron Fists, and are still damage dealers that are weak versus armor. These lads pick up some armor, melee defense, and a bronze shield, which makes them a little tankier. This makes them into a decent choice if you're moving your ogres to being your primary front lines, as they will last a little bit longer in combat, and give any other higher damage units time to move in and help them. Honestly, I would probably stick to Noblars and use these guys the same as regular bulls, as they will still do the same great damage, but just be a little bit more protected whilst doing it. Next up we have Iron Guts. These are a tier 2 unit, and are armoured and deal armor piercing damage. These lads are the toughest of all the Ogre infantry, with a massive amount of armor alongside their considerable health pool. Combine this with their high armor piercing damage and passable melee stats, and you have a unit that can take a lot of punishment just as easily as it can dish it out. They gain improvements in every single stat but speed over Ogre Bulls, so you want to do all the same jobs but only better. These guys would make for an excellent solo line free from Noblars, as they can handle most damage the enemy throws at them whilst doing plenty themselves, making for an excellent foundation for the Ogre playstyle. Just make sure they don't get too overwhelmed by a lot of armor piercing enemies, otherwise they will need support to stop them from crumbling under the pressure. Next we have Gorges. These are a tier 2 unit and deal armor piercing anti-infantry damage and come with Vanguard deployment and Stalk. A brief break from Ogres for the moment as we come to the Gorges. These are creatures that live in caves beneath the Ogre lands, and they are ferocious beasts. They are much less defended than Ogre units, with hardly any armour and very low melee defence, but they make up for this with their extremely high melee attack, weapon strength and unbreakable leadership that ensures they will be clapping and chomping on the enemy cheeks until the last man. They deal a great amount of armor piercing damage with the bonus versus infantry, so are great at taking out large clumps of enemies even if they have a lot of defense. Just make sure they don't get too overwhelmed versus anti-large, or they will start to feel a burn very quickly, and since they are unbreakable, it can be easy not to notice until it's too late. Next up we have man-eaters. These are a tier 2 unit and come with armor piercing damage. Back to the Ogres now, and these are some big ones. They improve in every stat but speed over regular Ogre bulls, and they're only beaten in armour by the Iron Guts, meaning these lads are bigger and tougher and hit a lot harder. They have great melee stats and fantastic armour piercing damage that allows them to take on most enemy units with ease, no matter how elite they are. They also have high leadership alongside immunity to psychology, so will be sticking around for a very long time in combat. You want to use them pretty much the same as Iron Guts. Ditch the Noblars by this stage and use these lads as a high damage front lines and apply pressure to the enemy as hard as you can to maintain your advantage. Charge them in now if you desire, but don't be afraid to leave them in to make the most of those damage and melee stats. These guys also come in a couple of variations. Iron Fist Man-Eaters are another tier 2 unit, and are Iron Fists and deal armor piercing damage. Similar to the Ogres before them, these variations gain more armor, melee defense, and a bronze shield, making them more tanky in pretty much every single way. It's a no-brainer to upgrade to these guys from the base units, as there is literally no downside aside from the price difference. You can use them exactly the same, and they'll do just as much damage whilst taking a little bit less. A other variation is the Great Weapons Man-Eaters. These are a tier 2 unit and deal armor piercing anti-large damage. These lads gain a small amount of charge bonus alongside that bonus versus large. This makes them into the giant killers of the Ogre infantry, as they can easily swarm a single large target and burst it down in moments, just as easily as they can catch some cav off guard and take them out before they can run off. You can choose either a mix of these lads and Iron Fists, or simply one or the other for your endgame front lines, and either would work as well as the other. Next we come to the Giant. This is a tier 3 unit and deals armor piercing anti-infantry damage and causes terror. The Giants. Long have they been the laughing stock of any roster that has had them. Whether it was due to their general uselessness or better options being available at the same time, there really has never been a good time to pick them up. Sadly, the story hasn't changed much here, since our next unit is better in pretty much every single way, and smaller. They do have a huge amount of HP. If they make it to melee combat, it'll take enemies a very long time to take them down. Combine that with their huge weapon strength and high melee attack, and they will rack up some massive body counts while they are in melee combat. The problem is that they often don't make it to melee or die shortly after they do, for one massive reason: their size. It's massive. They are simply too big a target for enemy range to ignore. Once they're all stood in combat, it's simple for even the weakest enemy ranged unit to focus them down and take a massive chunk of their HP in just a few simple volleys. If you really want to take this guy, then clear the enemy range as soon as possible, or be prepared for him to go down fast. Our final monster unit is the Stonehorn. This is a tier 3 unit, is armoured, and deals armor piercing anti-infantry damage, and is able to use collision attacks. As I said earlier, this lad performs the same job as Giants, but just does it better and safer. It may not have the same massive HP bar or weapon damage, but has a ton more armor, speed, and charge bonus, all while being a fraction of the size, meaning it isn't quite as huge a target for the enemy ranged. Don't get me wrong, it's still big, but it's just not quite as big. Besides, it comes with built-in missile resist, so even if you can't take out the enemy ranged, you're only going to feel a fraction of their damage. These lads are a great endgame frontlines monster that can dive in headfirst and make a massive impact with that initial charge bonus, and then continue to cause pain with their massive damage in a large area. Just send them in and watch the damage number shoot up, and you can't go wrong. We now come to the missile monsters and beasts. First up we have the Lead Belchers. These are a tier 2 unit and deal armor piercing damage and have armor piercing missiles. These are the heavy hitting ranged infantry of the Ogre roster. With a massive armor piercing missile strength from a pretty significant range, they can dismantle even the most armored of enemy troops with just a couple of volleys, and still have plenty of ammo to go around to everyone else. Carrying these large cannons does come at the cost, however, as they are slower than other Ogres, alongside having pretty terrible melee stats and charge bonus, meaning you want to keep them out of melee combat as much as possible to focus on finding them angles to get shots of the enemy lines. I'd deploy them ahead of your front lines, then move them back as the enemy closes in to keep them safe. Once lines have clashed, you can either focus fire them on any large targets to burst them down in an instant, or you can move around the enemy lines to get a clean shot of their flanks, free from the risk of friendly fire. Whichever you choose, you'll get a ton of value so long as they're firing and safe from melee combat. Next up we have the Ogre Pistol Man-Eaters. These are another tier 2 unit and are a hybrid unit. They deal armor piercing damage and can fire whilst moving. Now these are exactly the same as regular man-eaters, but now they've picked up pistols for some added ranged utility. They still have their excellent melee fighting prowess and damage, but you can use their ranged weapons for even more burst armor piercing damage. They can work great as an alternate range line, as they can easily get around the enemy lines and fire into their flanks before charging in to do some melee damage. They somehow do more range damage than Lead Belchers, though over a short range, so you need to decide if you're going to need that range before you take the plunge into the full man-eater spam. I would say if you're not the best at microing ranged units and finding the best angle, then these guys will work great, as they can get that ranged burst fire off quickly before they move in to finish the job. Not really a bad way to use them, since they really can do it all, so send them in any way you want and they'll have a great time. Our final missile monster is the Stone Horn Harpoon Launcher. This is a tier 3 hybrid unit, it's armoured, and deals armour piercing damage. This is another unit that is the exact same as the base unit, but now has a bit of extra ranged oomph. The closest unit I can compare this to is the Ancient Stegodon from the Lizardman. This lad is still that same frontlines melee monster, but now he has a long range weapon that he can do a huge amount of AP damage with, and snipe other enemy large targets with ease before moving in once they run out of ammo or can't find a shot. I would say to try and delay getting them in the front lines as long as possible, since they can do such a large amount of damage from a range, and you don't want to waste that before you move into melee combat. Keep them far back and safe and snipe anything you can get an angle on until you literally can't find no more, and then move them in for some smashing. If the enemy flanks and tries to attack him, they're only going to slow him down and add to his damage stat. And finally we come to the artillery and war machines. First up we have the Noblar Scrap Launcher. This is a tier 3 unit, deals anti-infantry damage over a massive range, and is fairly weak versus armour. Since this is a catapult unit, it has a steep firing arc, so has no problem firing over other units' heads and landing shots from half the map away with extreme precision. This lad has that huge range and massive missile strength and can deal devastating damage to clumps of infantry no matter where they are. You want to focus on these clumps to make most of that splash damage and also to ensure the highest possible chance of hitting, since faster moving targets will more easily dodge your shots. If you somehow manage to run out of ammo with these guys, they're also decent chariot units with their high mass, weapon strength and charge bonus. If you're going to do this, then make sure you are properly microing them, as if they get stuck alone in a clump of enemy units, they're going to disintegrate at a pretty rapid rate. Our final unit is the Iron Blaster. This is a tier 3 unit and deals armor piercing anti-infantry damage. These lads are cannons, so fire in a direct line, meaning that while they have a lot more missile strength than scrap launchers, they're a little harder to use to get your shots off, and also have a slightly shorter range. You want to use these lads to focus down key targets on the enemy lines, such as large targets or mounted lords, as their extremely high missile damage will be wasted on clumps of infantry and be some serious overkill. Make sure to always have a line of sight on these sorts of targets, and don't be afraid to use their high speed to get them into a better position if needed. Similar to scrap launchers, if they run out of ammo, they can engage the enemy in a spot of charging with their bonus weapon strength, but again, you have to micromanage the hell out of them to ensure they don't get pinned down and dismantled. We now come to the army compositions. In Warhammer 3, every unit has a tier from 1 to 3, and I'm going to be using these tiers to make you some armies for the early, mid and late game, so that you are set to fit every single step of your campaign. Starting with tier 1, our army is going to be led by a Slaughtermaster of the Great Maw. Going to pick up one of these lads as our lord since they are decent enough in combat alongside having that powerful magical value for a great multi-class lord. We're also going to go with the Lore of Maw because Ogres, and also I prefer the spells to the Lore of Beasts. For the front lines, we're going to go with 11 Noblars. We don't really have a choice, and realistically, you're probably going to have access to some Ogre Bulls at the very least, but the rules are the rules, so here we are. Going to use these lads in 2-3 lines, use one to keep the enemies still, and send the others around to surround them and break their spirits. Our other units are going to be 8 Saber-Tusk packs. These lads are going to be doing the majority of the damage at this stage in the game. They're going to get around the enemy front lines and take out ranged units as quickly as possible before coming back around to assist in the front lines, because God knows they need it. Now this composition, we're getting that magical value right out of the gate, alongside a lord who can fight just fine, so be an all-around great pick. The Noblars are pretty trash, but we have no choice, so taking this many, we can use their numbers advantage to swarm the enemies and take out high units than we should have any business taking out. The Saber-Tusks are going to provide all the damage that the Noblars are missing, and have enough speed to get around the map to help out wherever needed. Coming to tier 2, our Slaughtermaster of the Great Maw should be getting all those spells online and be spreading out the skill points to improve himself and the army even further. Going to pick up 2 heroes here, a Hunter and a Firebelly. We're picking these 2 up to drop our army counts even further, but these 2 are so worth it. The Hunter deals great damage no matter what it's doing, and eventually we'll get on that Stonehorn mount to make him a great pick for the end game. And the Firebelly with that Lore of Fire will deal great damage throughout the whole campaign and be a great complement to the more armor-piercing lore of the Maw. For the front lines, we're going to go with 2 Man-Eater Great Weapons and 5 Man-Eater Iron Fists. The Great Weapons will protect the flanks and be focusing down any large tags the enemy brings to the table, and the Iron Fist will be the tough front line that will soak enemy damage as well as dealing out a ton themselves while being supported by the rest of your army. For the ranged infantry, we're going to go with 6 Ogre Pistols. These lads will just do more damage in every single way than lead belchers, so we're going to go with them. They do great damage with their pistols, and if they get caught out or need to head into melee, they'll still do a bang-up job. And finally, we're dropping down to 4 Saber-Tusks because we still need something fast to take out the enemy back lines, but don't quite need as many as before, as the front line should more or less be fine without them by now. Now we've got a ton of hero value as all of our characters can get into those front lines and clean up most enemies alongside our 2 casters, providing a ton of spell support versus armor and squishies alike. Those front lines are tough and deal a ton of damage and will bowl over most enemy lines and hardly feel a scratch before pressing through and moving on. The range damage will work excellently versus the enemy large targets and burst down anything causing you trouble in a jiffy. And those saber tusks will take out any backlines threats, leaving your chunky boys free and safe to move in as they please. And finally we come to tier 3. Our Slaughtermaster of the Great Maw should be in his final form with all the spells and abilities you could ever want. The Hunter should be on the Stonehorn mount and be a terror from a range and up close. The Firebelly should have all the spells and abilities you want to wipe out hordes of enemies in a single cast. For our front lines, we're going to go to 4 Man-Eater Iron Fists, drop into just these lads as we have something else to take out the enemy large targets, and we want the front lines to be as tanky as possible. We're going to drop down to 4 Man-Eater Ogre Pistols, dropping a couple of these lads to make room for other units, but they should still be an excellent multi-class infantry. For our Cav, we're going to go with 4 Crusher Iron Fists. These will be a great sustained combat Cav, and while they can do a ton of damage cycle charging, you will be fine to send them in and leave them against most enemies, and they will come out on top with hardly a scratch on them. We're going to go with 1 Stonehorn Harpoon Launcher. This is going to work alongside your Mounted Hunter to focus down any large targets on the field with that powerful ranged weaponry before leaping into the front lines to get some huge area damage. And for the artillery, we're going to go with 2 Noblar Scrap Launchers and 2 Iron Blasters. The Scrap Launchers are going to focus down enemy clumps of infantry the whole battle through, or at least until they run out of ammo, and the Iron Blaster is going to help with the large target focus as well as sniping any other key targets as the enemy approaches before moving an angle to fire once the lines clash. Now this composition has that massive character value with 2 very powerful laws and 3 excellent fighters spreading the leadership buffs throughout your entire front lines. We have that tough front line alongside those excellent hybrid ranged units that can just as easily snipe from a range as they can get into the meat of the front lines. We have that Cav that can take out enemy backlines with ease and minimal management, and we have monsters and artillery that can crack the enemy armor before they even get close and give you an advantage right out of the gate. And that is every single thing you need to know about the Ogre Kingdoms in battle. If you enjoyed this video, then consider leaving a like, and of course subscribe to see more videos like this, including the Khorne campaign guide coming out on Monday. Leave any questions you have in the comments below and I'll answer them as best I can. I'd like to take this last little bit of time to thank supporters of the channel like Dominic Schmass and Adam T, and of course Henry Tucker and XJS for their support at that Unclean Ones tier. If you'd like to support the channel, you can become a member here on YouTube, a subscriber on Twitch, or a patron on Patreon. Doing so gets you shoutouts at the end of videos like all of these lovely people. Huge thanks to every single supporter, one final thank you for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.